just give us a filler to what, the kind of work that you're doing at ICMC in identifying and facilitating access to appropriate referral procedures, and in particular looking at the international best practice in relation to international law. And maybe you can also point out some gaps and challenges that you have faced in this regard. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Paddy, for the very nice introduction. Indeed, a pleasure to be with all of you. I can see that there are 150 participants, which is impressive. We are almost, yes, the second part of the marathon of the 23 objectives. And of course, it's not so easy to talk about Objective 12 for a number of reasons. The first one is that probably is not one of the fanciest one. It's, there are like, detention, like access to services, which seems to be the obvious choice when we want to focus on 3 or 4. Secondly, it's drafted in a bit of a strange way. And sorry to say that, but I just want to mention that, fortunately for me, I was, with civil society part of the negotiations. So I know a little bit the history of all the objectives, including Objective 12. But if I were a new reader, I would be puzzled, because this objective includes few elements which apparently have nothing to do with the other ones. So it starts by basically saying that there should be transparent, predictable migration procedure for all migrants. So what does it mean? I don't know. Do governments have the ambition to have proper registration of every single migrant? That seemed to be a bit of a dream and not necessarily realistic, apart from having access to various procedures, labor, etc., or student visa. But it's a nice commitment, but it doesn't mean much in practice. Then secondly, you have then maybe something which is more important, is the importance for government to identify vulnerable groups. And probably we are there much closer to the real identity of this objective, is that within migration procedures and among migrants, you have people who have special needs, who have special vulnerabilities, and need to be identified as such. And finally, a third element of this objective is at the very end of the objective is the need to have procedures when you have mixed migration. So when you basically have arrival of a mix of refugees, migrants with vulnerabilities, migrants seeking job opportunities, you need to have procedures in place to do a bit of screening, profiling, and identifying of people who may have very specific needs. My final comment, and I may come back to that, what makes the way it has been drafted confusing is that if we look at the initial draft of the Global Compact, what we call the zero draft, Article 12 is very different. So it means that when it was proposed to them, this initial draft was problematic for a number of governments. So I will come back to that.
Do you just want to dive in a little bit before I will ask I'll ask the next speaker? What from the drafting and I think it's very important for people to understand that you have been really instrumental and in the background when this was drafted, and then sort of seeing it being listed out as a commitment that I think if I can borrow this word, as a lump sum objective, so an objective that tries to solve everything but is actually not very pragmatic. So how would you say in the last couple of years since the compact has been running, implementation is another thing, do you sort of see some governments who have been very pragmatic through your work at ICMC that have tried to take a much more pragmatic way with dealing with this sort of unpacking of this lump sum as they try to implement the priority plans around GCM?
Let's face it, a number of the elements that you have in Objective 12 predates the compact. And a number of governments have been putting in place procedures to identify, for example, victims of trafficking, child-sensitive procedures, gender-sensitive procedures do exist in a number of countries. You have, and that's probably the most important, is that you have such procedures in situation of mixed migration. And UNHCR, many years back in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, developed a document which is called the 10-point strategy applying in mixed migration situation, where precisely the objective is to not only to make distinction between refugees and migrants, but to identify vulnerable migrants, in particular victims of trafficking, women at risk, children, etc., people with disabilities, etc., and to have in place a system which means that the people in need of special consideration of special needs would basically be identified at the beginning of the process and could be referred to the right institutions, etc., etc. So we are talking at really processes and procedures which predates the Global Compact.
Thank you for that, Stefan. Maybe we will come back to you sort of in terms of understanding, like you have said, some of these issues obviously do predate GCM, and also to see how, how governments have sort of taken this forward in terms of really articulating it in their priority list. So it would be interesting to hear some country examples as well, in as difficult, or let's say as lump sum as it is, and as an objective, how have countries sort of taken it forward? But then let's move on to our next speaker, Alethea Fernandez de la Reguera. Alethea, I think just before I give I think you're worth a long introduction, and I wanted to note there that it seemed very interesting that you have done for your PhD, you did a dissertation where you were talking about the autonomy processes for decision-making of Mexican female migrant workers who were returning from the US. And I think we will throw in a bit of a spotlighting for you to take us a little bit into what this sort of means in terms of the objective that we have in front of us. Female migrants, their vulnerabilities, and how that is plugged into the assessment. But before I do that, let me just, and before I introduce your question, let me just introduce Alethea to our audience here. Alethea is an associate researcher at the Institute of Legal Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and where she coordinates the National Laboratory on Diversities. And mostly her research looks at the study of gender immigration policies, the institutional violence, as well as looking at immigration detention processes. And she's coordinating the Erasmus MA program, which looks at Euroculture at the University of Mexico, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And she has, for the last 5 years, been a guest scholar at another program, which is at the University of Lille in France, that looks at transnational migrations. And she obtained her PhD with honors in humanistic studies from the Tecnológico de Monterrey, with a dissertation, as I mentioned, which looked at the autonomy processes of decision-making of Mexican female migrant workers that were returning from the US. She has an MA in European Studies from the University of Amsterdam and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations, as well as having been a member of different networks of researchers. She also collaborates a university seminar on international displacement, migration, exile, and repatriation at her university. She's part of UNESCO's technical chair on the ethics and peace studies, and a board member of the Institute of Women in Migration based in Mexico City. Alethea, for us, I mean, I made sure to mention all the research experience because I think we would like to bring this discussion in that way. I mean, we would say that in the broad sense, and if we look at sort of, for instance, forced migration, we can see that it is characterized really by a large number of migrants who are in need of international protection. And on the other side, you see enforcement of policies that try to criminalize and also to detain migrants and immigrants. So what would be the main challenges that you see posed by Objective 12? And here we would sort of really like you to look at things like accountability and transparency of migration procedures, and also the kind of capacity building efforts that are going, whether it's looking at training of officials, whether it's also looking at counseling for migrants, and also trying to bring in, as Stefan had just said, this sort of gender responsive and child sensitive referral mechanisms, which are obviously the gold standard, but how is that coming in? So from your research experience, it would be good for us to get a good sense also of the recommendations on how we can strengthen these legal certainty and predictability in migration procedures. And also, like I said, coming in from that gender lens. Over to you, Alethea.
Thank you very much, Patty. And it is a great pleasure to be with you all. Here in Mexico, it's 6 a.m. in the morning. So I'm very happy to be with you today. Yeah, regarding like the challenges of Objective 12, I totally agree with Stefan that some of the main points of these objectives already existed before the Global Compact. Many countries already had these protocols to enforce accountability and transparency, and also, of course, the gender sensitive and child sensitive procedures. Together with all the different aspects of Objective 12. But I believe that one of the main challenges that we're seeing, of course, that I am talking from my own perspective, as you said, Patty, I am a sociologist and I do a lot of field work, but I study like the Mexican and the US and the Central American region. But I also studied the European region as well, not directly, but I think we share some aspects. Unfortunately, I am not an expert in all regions and I would have loved to understand more what's happening in India, but the reality is that we're seeing that detention procedures are growing every day, and that depending on the region, of course, but this is part of some particular situation that like that these mixed flows that are expressed in the Objective 12, the reality is that we're seeing like new structural features of mobility. I believe that sometimes international law is left behind, like with categories of understanding the difference between a labor migrant and a forced migrant. And I believe that a big challenge in terms of accountability and transparencies, it happens in transit countries because many people, many migrants in reality are forced migrants. And I believe that we need to think on a global governance of migration in terms of what are the priorities and the needs for these people. What's happening in the transit countries? One of the main problems that we also observe is that some of the main obstacles are faced in the access of the territory. Some people don't even have the right to access territory in destination countries. So I would highlight the importance of think about Objective 12 in terms of transit countries and the point of access to the destination countries. With this also in this era of externalization of borders, we must say that this is a big challenge for international law and for the Objective 12. The other point that I would like to highlight, and maybe we can discuss further, is that there is this public and this global discourse that criminalize immigrants. Immigrants are stigmatized as criminals, as sick people. Now with the COVID pandemic, we're seeing how this crisis that we saw in 2014 in Europe, and that we're seeing now since 2018 in the Americas with the exodus of people that are fleeing from violence, from death. Now it is accentuated by this discourse of they are not only dangerous, but they are also sick. They might bring COVID-19. So these particular situations of crisis, they enforce the criminalization of migrants. So I would like to highlight the effects of this public and this global discourse that criminalize and stigmatize migrants, and the effects of this discourse in all different levels of the procedures that are approached in objective number 12. And finally, because I know we don't have much time, but I think it's very important to understand, if we already have these procedures, this training, we understand we need protocols for accountability, etc. What's one of the main obstacles for us, what we're seeing, is a discretionary use of policies. We do have trained agents, we do have trained officials, we do have, like I said, gender responsive and child sensitive referral protocols, but there are still discretionary use of policies, because many of the laws, of national laws, immigration laws, they have this particularity that in some occasions, in some situations, the agents can decide whether or not to refer with a gender sensitive or child sensitive protocol, or whether or not they decide if this person is really a labor migrant or is a person who is a forced migrant. And then the referral mechanism changes completely. So I would say, like, the third challenge for me would be, what about the discretionary use of agents, and what is the role of the subjectivities of these officials within the whole process of referral? And I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Patty.
Alethea, thank you for that. And I think, like you said, we would need to get back to that last question. I think that stands quite crucial, sort of the discretionary use that I think for me just goes even beyond migration policy, but also national policies that you have in sort of trying to really make a distinction between them and us. And I think we are also seeing this sort of the discretionary use of policy in terms of how urban migration is also being managed there, and who has access to what then at the end of the day, especially in the times of COVID, when we've sort of seen those who are part of a vulnerable group and migrants can sort of, because of the lack of law that goes to protect them directly, can sort of be left out. And it's sort of a deliberate, you would say it's a deliberate move that's been made by tagging into policies that would not normally look like a migration policy. In this case, in terms of access, for instance, to health provisions or even education, as it has been in some cases, especially with the COVID pandemic highlighting this. So I think we should come back to that and sort of try to dive a little bit into it. And in this, I would say maybe also looking at, the kind of work that you have done and kind of work on research. Have you seen these vulnerabilities then that come with being disadvantaged by policy, or being the previous point that you made in terms of criminalization of migration, how that then impacts on women? Does that impact on women and girls a bit more differently? What does that sort of mean? And maybe even if you wanted to go into some very, let's say, human story examples of how this can be highlighted and how it's actually magnified as a female migrant in terms of the impact that it has, because you don't have a proper assessment of your vulnerabilities, and the law misses that, or the law is not very clear about how that is done. And so as you digest that one, Alethea, let me ask Henry Lloras. I think we are with us in the room, and I just give an introduction before I come to what the question you would be addressing. And Henry he's an attorney, and he's the president of the Lawyers Beyond Borders in the Philippines. And this is an association of lawyers and paralegals who provide legal assistance to disadvantaged Filipino migrant workers. And this institution is also part of the Lawyers Beyond Borders network. And of course, then this is that institution, and I think it's important for me to add this context, is that it's an international network of lawyers that's organized by the Migrant Forum in Asia. And it looks to provide assistance for those migrant workers that are in distress. And I think it's, you know, Henry, we will be looking to hearing a little bit more, because, you know, we are in a period of distress. We actually don't know when this ends, but of course, for migrants, this situation is even much more, you know, it actually heightens the kind of distress that they are in. And he is a senior partner in Royas and UI Law Offices and a volunteer legal counsel of the Center for Migrant Advocacy in the Philippines. He's also the president. He's also yeah, the Lawyers Association, like I mentioned, is already, you know, housed under the Migrant Forum in Asia. And he obtained his bachelor's degree and his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Philippines. And he has also authored a book which is published and available since June 2016 that looks at the Philippine jurisprudence on overseas employment, as well as Philippines laws, rules, and regulations on overseas employment. So these two publications are actually available online, and I think we'll be sharing also those links. Now, coming to why we have asked Henry to be with us here. Henry, we just wanted you to talk to us a bit about countries of origin, and I think it really comes in at the right time with what Alethea has mentioned. What is the role of countries of origin? What is the role of these sending countries? And, you know, what kind of gaps have you identified, not just from the organization that you're with, but some of the work that you're doing? And when you have met with various migrants who are in distress, what kind of gaps have you identified from a sending country's perspective? And here, you know, we can look at the Philippines or we can look at other countries in terms of dealing also with the issues of sort of stateless persons as well, in, you know, looking at the gravity of the issue. Because we do understand that in a way, this identity, like we have talked about in other webinars, gives you really the right on access to many different things. But we have a lot of undocumented migrants, and we also have migrants who would not have that kind of identification. So I just wanted to marry these two things together, you know, talking about people who would not have the right documentation that then doesn't give them access to be captured into these systems that governments are making. So we're really thinking of alternative ways of dealing with this mixed migration flows and the peculiarities that are also happening. So if you could just go into this and give us your reflection on that, Henry.
Okay, thank you for the kind introduction, Paddy, and good day to all our friends who are with us in this webinar today. I would like to share two reflections on 2 points of Objective 12. No? It's really quite broad, no? And from the perspective of lawyers from assisting migrant workers coming from countries of origin, the information on migration laws, policies, and procedures of countries of destination are of great importance to us and to would-be migrant workers. So Objective 12 is really important, as if the information as to the certainty and of course the predictability of what the existing rules and regulations on migration in the countries of origin are, and how to transmit this information to would-be migrant workers in the countries of origin. We could actually relate from this perspective Objective 12 to two other objectives. Objective 1, we studied this earlier, that Objective 1 refers to the collection and utilization of accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based policies. Now, if we can go into these details of Item 1, there are certain information and data that can be gathered that can also be used in strengthening and making migration and immigration policies of countries of destination more human rights based, no? And more promoting of the rights and welfare of migrant workers. We could also relate this to the third objective, which to provide accurate and timely information at all stages of migration. If we have enough information about and the correct information, useful information, immigration, migration policies of countries of destination, these are very useful information that could be provided for pre-departing migrant workers from the countries of origin. looking at this from, it's mentioned here in Objective 12, Item A, that's one of the objective, the transparency and accessibility of migration procedures and how to communicate. That's these requirements of entry, admission, stay, work, study, and activities, and introducing technology. So the objective is to simplify the information and how to bring this information to migrant workers that can be of use to them. Now, for countries of origin, intervention would be much better if information is provided to would-be migrant workers before they leave the country of origin, with through focused or directed information and education materials and platforms. In the Philippines, we have this pre-departure orientation seminars, and before that, even pre-employment seminars that we give to would-be departing migrant workers. And I think there are also several countries of countries of origin who have these orientation seminars, so that they can give relevant information prior to the departure of migrant workers. But these are usually generic information seminars, and not so specific as to the country where the migrant workers would actually be working. Now, it is possible that if we can make interventions or identify points of intervention at the country of origin, where in addition to this general generic pre-departure orientation seminars, focused information, country-focused information can be given. Yesterday, we had a discussion with the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines on gaps. And this is one of the gaps that has been identified, and that has been the subject of our online discussion yesterday. For instance, even as early as for the passport application stage of the would-be migrant worker, it would be we would be able to identify in the stages of preparatory to migration where the government agencies or NGOs can already intervene in order to provide the needed information. So if we could identify these points of intervention, let's say at the passport application or visa application, or when they apply for work with the recruitment agency, we could provide them with focused information in addition to the general pre-departure information. It can be in the form of online platform that can be useful for all, not only for Filipinos. For example, a development of an online repository of the immigration laws, rules, and procedures of destination countries that may be accessed online and regularly updated should be of great use, continuing use, not only for pre-departing workers, but to all migrant workers, even in the countries where they are working. So that's one point. And second point, as you also mentioned earlier, one reflection that I would like to share is on the issue of children of migrant workers, especially the children of undocumented migrant workers. Item D of Objective 12 speaks about migrant children in terms of identification when they first arrive at country and providing them with the proper classification and services. However, one public situation for migrant children is, the children of migrant workers, especially those of undocumented workers. We've had encountered cases or situation of unregistered children of undocumented migrant workers. Now, for the Philippines, this is we do not share a common border, land border with any country, but we have close countries and around us, and one place, Sabah. There are many cross-border Filipino migrants there, and they've been there for generations, and of course, they have children of these migrants. What comes up usually in this situation is what is the citizenship or nationality of these children, some of whom are not registered at birth. No? How will they be able to access proper health, medical, and educational services if they are not even recognized in the countries where they are located? No? Now, in the case of the Philippines, we follow the jus sanguinis principle, which is the citizenship based on the nationality or citizenship of the parents. And under our present constitution, it is enough for a child is considered a natural born Filipino citizen, provided either of his or her parents, either the mother or the father, is a Filipino citizen. No? So even if the child is born in another country, no, following the the jus sanguinis principle, as long as it can be established that one of the parents is a Filipino, that child is a Filipino. So if the country of destination follows the jus soli principle, or the place of birth, the citizenship is acquired from the place of birth, it is possible that the child can acquire dual citizenship under Philippine law. No? So what I am citing this because, in a way, it is easier for us Filipinos in addressing this issue of birth registration of children, because it establishes a degree of stability and predictability as long as the nationality of either parent can be established. The only difficult situation that may arise is when it is, let's say, for second generation migrants, and it's even the birth or citizenship of the parents cannot be established. No? So those are the more problematic situation. But if that is the situation, no, then we can look into how consular services can be provided to the undocumented migrants and their children, especially in terms of documentation and registration of birth, especially in those countries where they are subject to arrest, or because of their undocumented status, or they are not allowed to register by reason of their status. Okay. Thank you, Paddy.
Henry, thank you for that. And thank you for coming in on just on that very last one. I'm tending to think, let's talk a bit about, overseas Filipino workers who have probably traveled, let's say, somewhere close by in the region, Hong Kong, China, to cite a couple of examples. And then for that first trip, they were regular. But then, of course, they became undocumented because they overstayed. And that means that they're in a situation in which they would not have the right legal status to stay in that country, but they still do continue to work either as domestic workers, which is sort of the practice that is seen when you look at southern China as well as in Hong Kong. Actually, there is quite a flow between Hong Kong into southern China, because the demand for domestic workers in China at some point increased, and also the package that you would get in southern China was much more attractive than you would compare, for instance, in Hong Kong, and goes many other reasons for that kind of irregular channel that was foreseen. And in this case, those migrants would not, the first point of contact would probably not be the Filipino embassy or the consulate in this case. So is there any alternatives that you see through the work that you have done that tries to bring irregular migrants or undocumented migrants, but from this consular protection, from this consular service, if we could call that, support that's given from the Filipino government, that tries to still embrace its citizens, even though they're in an undocumented way, because then that's the only way you would make sure that you have your, this citizenship right that you've given is passed on to the child, is if the parents have sort of had some kind of contact. But this is me thinking. Could you walk us through a little bit?
Yes. In our experience in the Philippines with respect to undocumented migrants, in order to reach out to the undocumented migrants, the community of migrant workers, the migrant workers organizations, even the churches and the faith-based groups play a key role, because undocumented migrants are not trusting, do not trust authorities. They're always afraid of their status, that they may get arrested or be deported. No? But even here in our overseas voting laws in the Philippines, even undocumented migrants can vote, no? As long as they can establish their Filipino citizenship. And we encourage even our undocumented countrymen abroad to vote. And how to reach them? It has to be you have to go through people they trust, people who are able to help them in real terms in the community. And these are the community leaders of the Filipino communities abroad, or the religious groups where they may be affiliated. So that's the way to bring them to accessing information and services of the Philippine government, of the Philippine consulates, and even of the host countries. That's because it is important to establish that bridge, that contact, and the trust.
Henry, I think that was a good way to sort of bring out role of community and the diaspora, actually, in sort of trying to engage with undocumented migrants. And I think like you have said, in the case of the Philippines, the diaspora community, but also the churches that are attached one way to another to the Filipino communities, have also been a way of trying to make sure that even undocumented migrants get their rights, as migrants, regardless of their status. So thank you very much. And I think we will come back to you in some of the questions in the Q&A. And before we go to the next speaker, I just wanted to encourage all the participants in the room today that we do have a Q&A tab, which is also the chat function, essentially in your Skype somewhere down there. Please type your questions to all the panelists, because in a bit we will be going through some questions that have been raised in the question and answer in the chat box. So please feel free to outline, and I think we may even have an opportunity to call upon some of you to raise your questions. I will call upon some of our panelists as well, just when we finish with our last but not the least panelist, Florida. And I think there is only one important sentence to describe Florida. I know that she has done a lot of different work, and our friends at the Migrants Forum in Asia have a long-standing friendship, if we can put it in this way. And she's a long-time civil society activist in the area of migrants, and she has done a lot of work in Malaysia, a country that we know has a large number of migrants, diverse groups documented, as well as a large number that still remains largely undocumented. And Florida, we just wanted to ask you if you could just having had the discussion now, and Henry just pointed out a very important issue in the role of community, the role of diaspora. And also maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what you saw in your experience in terms of return case management. How did that work in your experience? So really talking about how the migrant experience is like in terms of them integrating into their space, but then also what happens when the decision, whether it's made by them or not, has to be made to return home. So what kind of cases, what kind of, we would say, specific things did you sort of observe? What was the role of the community in sort of providing the necessary support? And I think you could also talk to us a little bit about the gaps and the challenges that you have seen in terms of improving case management. Florida, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. I think that's a very good opening for me as well. And I would really love to take this opportunity to share with you the best lesson that I have actually learned individually about migration. In fact, when I first went into a migration project, I was clueless. I had no idea what I was doing. But the best thing that ever taught me is actually walking through and walking with migrant workers. They taught me a lot of things that you hardly see in books or you read. And that was one of the greatest challenge that actually started off in the migration process when I first joined in. And Malaysia, as you have rightly pointed out, it's actually a receiving country, and the challenges here is really, really great. There's a lot of lessons to learn, and there's a lot of work need to be done. As the first speaker pointed out, clearly there is a lot of complexity in migration process itself. But the way the country looks into migration, they look into in a very narrow scale. You know, it's either you are documented, you're a migrant worker, you are here to work, or you are illegal. You know, they put you in that kind of a lump. And that creates a lot of complexity in decision making, in advocating for their rights, and also in terms of fighting for their rights through the MRC work itself that I have actually seen. Now, for instance, if you look at refugees and asylum seekers, so in Malaysia, in Malaysian context, for example, until and unless you have the refugee status recognition given to you, it has some form of advantage, some form of protection. But nevertheless, if you look at the law itself, it's a bit complex. It's not fully protecting their rights, in terms of they are left out in a lot of benefits. For example, in the workforce, they are not recognized while they are allowed to stay and reside in the country, but they're not allowed to be in the workforce. So how are refugees are going to survive if they're not allowed in the workforce? This is just a tip of an example. And the migrant resource centers actually played a huge role, because you can talk to any civil societies out there. They will tell you that a migrant worker will not be able, in most cases, will not be able to defend himself on his own. He definitely needs some help. There are migrants who have been able to, go. If they're documented, they have some leverage to defend themselves on their own. But if they're undocumented, it poses a lot of other challenges as well. So it's a challenge. It's a big challenge. So you can see, and some of them is also ignorance. Even if you're undocumented, there are laws that is actually protecting you. But to a migrant worker, he doesn't see that, because what he sees is that, look, I'm undocumented, whatever venues I go to, even for health, even for COVID, it was one example. If he wants to go, he feels that he's not well, he needs to be tested, or he needs to be, screened if he had COVID, or maybe he could suspect, or he may not even have that. But if he goes to the hospital for check, one of his fear is, will I be arrested? That will be his greatest fear. So if you have, in Malaysia, we have this movement control order. So if you have a cluster of a group of migrant workers who has infected with COVID-19, rest assured, if you have undocumented migrant workers within the group, they'll be the first one to flee. And that tells you a lot. But I think COVID-19 is a lesson that we all should learn. It does not discriminate, but the policies does. So where are we? Where are we in this whole scenario of undocumented worker? But another most important thing I wanted to say is that when we do research, when we do findings, most of them do not, especially research done by the government, the undocumented migrant groups of workers, they are refugees, asylum seekers, stateless person, name it, a lot of them, they are not captured in any data. So when you don't capture this, how do you move to have a very transparent and very effective social dialogue for us to come to make a decision? So the challenge and the complexity is huge. I mean, it's, for me, maybe later down the road, if people wanted to know, there's a lot of aspects why migrant workers become undocumented, and why some documented become undocumented, some do come in undocumented. There's a lot of issues, there's a lot of complexity. This is something that a lot of people don't understand, sadly, except for civil societies and people who are advocating for that. You don't see the lawmakers looking into it. You don't see the government looking into it, or ministry is looking at it. But overall, the scariest part, especially in the light of Malaysia, is that migration is looked in the point of security. So when you look at security, everything is watered down. The decision is watered down, the discussion is watered down, because they solely want to look at it at the point of security. So I feel that, it's time that things should move. It's time that people should speak up. And the saddest part to say is that during this COVID-19, when we look at the perspective of Malaysians in light of migrants, there was a lot of negative comment was being highlighted. Suddenly it just kind of, boomed and came up, which is also an aspect that I think we strongly need to deal with and, need to address, because the Malaysian perspective is that looking at migrant workers, as, maybe like bringing in diseases and associated with crime, which is not a fact that is, it's not a fact. It cannot be proven. It is, in fact, research has not proven it. The crime rate committed by foreigners are very minimal. It's about only below 4%, but yet you see the image portrayed towards a migrant worker is so different. It's so negative, which is sad. I'll be happy to answer more questions, if any direct questions, especially in terms of looking at us as a receiving country. Why do we see Malaysia? Why do we see that migration is a threat? I would be happy to discuss this more later in the discussion. Thank
Florida, I like that you are asking yourself the question that I was just about to ask, because having lived in Malaysia myself, I've sort of always said this whenever I have the opportunity. I don't think I have been. I mean, there are a few places in the world that feel like in your everyday life you have met several nationalities, and this place is Malaysia. I mean, from the minute you walk, you leave your home to enter into a grocery store, to walk into a small restaurant down the road to have your breakfast of roti canai, to the minute you finish getting your durian at the market and head back home, you would have encountered quite a number of migrant workers who are providing services along this way. So whether they're working in the service sector or they've come there to work in the informal sector, whichever way, as domestic workers in construction as well, quite a large number that are coming. But yet you have these questions that you have raised as a receiving country. What really is the attitude of the local community to these migrants who provide very important services? And I think I wanted you to also make a little bit more comment in terms of sort of the criminalization that comes with the lack of identification or a lack of being documented. I think you saw the rise in the number of migrants being victims, if you like, for instance, of immigration raids, and that also meant that migrants had to choose, especially the undocumented ones, had to choose sometimes even more health risky behavior. So for instance, if they were living in one part of town, they had to find other friends that they would live with, and that meant social distancing, forget about that. And also in terms of ensuring that you can do any contact tracing when any of the migrants got COVID, became very difficult because of this criminalization of being undocumented. So I was hoping that you could also speak a little bit into that, and then and as well to just touch a bit on the gender aspect as well. What kind of do you sort of see some gaps, because you did talk about some opportunities, if we can, in the legislation that sort of allow also for female migrants to feel that they have access to a bit more protection. So let's say to legislation that goes more to protection of women.
Okay, in terms of the first question that you asked, why does the community perceive migrant workers in this particular way? I can share some experience that I had when I was actually working with the union, and in what I saw there is that with the members, not necessarily in the leadership, but in the members, what I actually saw is that a lot of this negativity comes is because when you look at the workers, the local workers themselves, they are really left out in a lot of deals within themselves, benefits within themselves in terms of even salary, which is not up to their living needs. So when salaries are undermined, the first person they tend to see is that migrants are taking our jobs away and migrants are keeping our salary low. That is a perception that a lot of people tend to have, but they don't see it in the way that migrants are actually doing the job, in most cases, jobs that locals either do not wish to do it, or there is under supply of labor. So that aspect is not really being advocated, not being campaigned, and it's not been really being seen. But it is true that a lot of Malaysians, especially during COVID-19, when jobs was being slowing down and working hours has been slashed, salaries has been slashed, so they see the impact on themselves. And without looking into the real discussion and the real picture, they tend to divert, and unfortunately they tend to blame the migrant workers, which is not a good thing. So a lot of education needs to be done, a lot of promotion and campaign needs to be focused in this area. The second part, when you talk about criminalization, one of the things that civil society has been very highly advocating is that during COVID, especially, we know that the rate is going on. We know it's a constant thing. Rate is a constant thing. We had a lot of amnesties after amnesties, and unfortunately, we don't know. I would say that it may not have actually had a very great impact than it was expected, but one of the strongest advocacy made by civil society during this time is not to arrest migrant workers. And they had a very valid point in saying that, because when you show and set an example of arresting migrant workers, many are going to flee away. And when they do that, if that person is asymptomatic person, there is a very high chance that the disease could be spread. But sad to say, that was not the decision it has been made. And when we're talking about, and civil society have also said criminalizing migrant workers is not the way forward to deter undocumented migrant workers. There are other steps that the government can actually take in order to reduce the number of undocumented migrant workers. And this is something that we would encourage more dialogue to take place with the government. And Ministry of Human Resources plays a very important role in and it's important to see where the position is also in terms of strategies. How do you reduce the number of undocumented? And it is also not an encouraging thing for undocumented migrant workers to be in Malaysia, because they are being constantly put into a very vulnerable stage. Their salaries are not being paid. They do long hours of work. There's absolutely no rights and no benefits to protect them. So there must be an alternative to detention, and that is my very strong viewpoint. There is a way. It's just that how do we come forward to that? And in terms of gender, yes, there is a lot of gap in gender, and one big group of large number of migrant workers, sectors of workers, the domestic workers, they are absolutely are being sidelined in terms of protection from the main, even though they are documented, and worse still if they're undocumented, as in terms of the labor protection, the existing labor protection that we have, it's very limited. To say that the protection is only given to them in terms of wages and in terms of termination benefits, but you don't see any other protection in that phase. And that opens to a lot of vulnerability towards domestic workers themselves. And a lot of complaints and abuses has been recorded through the MRCs that has been running in Malaysia, and the numbers are high. I was also being told that during the COVID-19, the fear of them bringing the disease to the other members of the family, what some did, they just took the migrant workers and just left them on the street on their own, with nowhere and no place to go, until some good people who saw them, good Samaritans who saw them and referred them to the organization who runs shelters for protection. So this was some of the challenges that is very highly faced by domestic workers themselves. I hope I have answered.
I think you have touched on the critical part of the answer, and I think we will come back to you in a bit. I just wanted to go back again to Stefan, if Stefan is with us, to sort of talk to us a little bit about, you know, some of the work that they have been doing at ICMC, and sort of in trying to understand how they have recontextualized, if you like, this objective for the countries in which they are working, and in trying to address some of the gaps that it misses, as he had explained. But before I do that, I thought that maybe I would invite some of the side panelists, as we call them, to just come and give us a bit of their reflection on this particular objective. I mean, it's true that if somebody walked into the room right now, they would see us talking a lot about undocumented workers. They would see us having a bit of focus on female migrant workers, the role of the diaspora and everyone. Because I think what we try to do also within these discussions is to think about what is really outside of the box in terms of what we have as tools to work with. Like everyone among our speakers has said, a lot of the procedures in terms of, you know, assessment and referral had been pre-existing before. So what are the gaps that we actually miss? What are the groups that we are not even able to tap in so that we're able to provide the right assistance, whether it's looking at durable solutions, or we are looking at, you know, people being repatriated, or just understanding the vulnerabilities and the needs that they would have at that very moment. And of course, the issue of mixed, and we're always looking at these things in the context of a mixed migration flow as well, because it's also important to realize that migrants, especially in most parts of the world, it's a mixed group of migrants that is moving together. It's refugees, asylum seekers, economic seekers, and even those who are running just to look for a safe home and a space, and even those who would be running for their own individual persecution. Moving in flows. So I thought that it would be interesting to ask Innocent Duru. I don't know if you're with us, Innocent Duru, who is with a news outlet. Innocent, can you hear me? I think you've been made audible. Innocent, are you with us? Let me see if Innocent is with us. How do I check that? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Oh, super. Yes. Innocent is with us, and I'll just ask Innocent to give a bit of an intro. I mean, he's coming from a media house that covers a lot of stories about migration in Africa. But I wanted to get your take, Innocent, even as you will introduce yourself, so that the audience can know who you are and your background. You could just tell us a bit about what you have seen from your perspective of covering these stories. When migrants are coming across to you, what is the feeling that you see in the press in terms of the kind of support that they're getting from government systems to get the protection they need, regardless of whether it's somebody who is in a regular or an irregular way? Over to you, Innocent.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Paddy. I'm Innocent Duru, the Executive Director of Voice for African Migrants. Our organization, a media organization, looks at the issue of migration in Africa and the world generally. So we report and we also assist migrants where necessary in the area of advocacy. What we have seen is that there is less and less attention from government to migrants. I can tell you that just last Thursday, some Nigerians were deported from Austria and Germany. And to our surprise, when they came into the country, as usual, the government officials will not be there to welcome them or to even assist them at all. Some of these deportees don't have a dime on them to go to their various houses. They are stranded at the airports. They don't have means of communicating with their family members. They don't have anywhere to stay. They turn to beggars on the streets. And these were the people that were remitting money back to the country when they were abroad. The money that were remittances were what the country was using to develop and make progress in different areas of life. But once they are deported, the country abandons them, treats them as criminals. You see how they are smuggled into a vehicle and dumped at a very obscure area at the airport and just left to roam about. Some of them begin to beg for money to go home. So, and to our surprise, with the COVID issue all over the whole world, we're surprised that when they were even brought last Thursday, secretly, there was no COVID test done on them when they came into the country. And that was
Innocent, you muted yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Now you're back. Now you are back, Innocent. We can hear you.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Okay. So they came into the country, and we're expecting that, okay, when they come in, the government should be there to say, okay, you are welcome back to the country. What can we do for you? And I didn't even know that there were allegations of immigration officials extorting money and materials from these people.
Okay, Innocent, I think your connection was not so good, but I think we can bring you back after the next speaker. I think that was a very interesting way of sort of talking about how the referral process ends, to what, on a textbook or on a case management document would say return, and how reintegration actually is not taking place, or, the right kind of support given to migrants once they have arrived and they've ended their journey, regardless of how they end their journey, and the kind of support that they would need. And I think it's also very important what you highlighted in terms of understanding and actually making migrants even much more vulnerable to the COVID pandemic, in the sense that they don't have, they're not being treated like any other passenger. Today, if you decide to make any trip in some countries, even by train, in some countries by road, and if you are flying, there are so many provisions that you need to fulfill, not just to keep the environment that you are going into safe, but to make sure that you yourself, are safe. And so I think it's very important, these linkages that you've made, and we will come back to you again later on. I wondered if William is here with us. William, are you with us? William, I think William is with us.
He's there.
Okay, I will see, William, I thought that I should just, bring you in from the Migrant Forum in Asia, to just give us a bit of your reflections on how you have seen, Stefan, in his intro, I think he really did highlight, and other speakers as well have talked about how this is, what I'm calling a lump sum objective that tries to put a lot of different things in there that, and pragmatism doesn't seem to be is something that's embedded in the objective itself. So I wanted to hear from you what your reflections are like, but also just because we know that you have been, like others in the panel, in the background of preparation for GCM objectives, and that the forum has also given quite a lot of input through yourself and others in shaping some of the objectives. Do you really see this shaping out to the ambitions that were there with the people around the table? William, are you able to take this one?
Yeah, sure, Patty, thanks. I was not expecting you to bring me in, so, but thank you for that. And I think a number of the panelists have talked about the COVID as an example. I like the way Stefan started by saying a lot of what is in Objective 5 predates the compact. But I think one of the things that we have seen in the compact, or at least during the time of the COVID, is how a lot of this fell apart, kind of thing, and that was the challenge. Where we saw in the repatriation process, in the reintegration process, in the roundups kind of thing, where because of the fear of COVID and Florida has referred to it. We saw in Malaysia, for example, a crackdown on migrant workers and then stacking them up in detention centers. We've seen this in the Gulf countries as well. Videos have gone viral of migrants being picked up and put into these kind of repatriation centers without knowledge of countries of origin, and then countries of origin scrambling when a social media kind of video is released and things like that. So I think a lot of this, what Objective 12 is trying to indicate, move towards, and some kind of coherence, some kind of procedure, some kind of mechanisms, even looking at, formalities kind of thing. I think the test of it is in times of crisis. And at least what we have seen now in this COVID period is that a lot of what was in place was so fragile that it fell apart. And stakeholders were scrambling across the board kind of thing, and largely civil society, I would say, came out in a very strong way in a response to this, both in countries of origin as well as countries of destination. So from Bangladesh, in our region, from Bangladesh right up to the Philippines, we have seen a tremendous role played by civil society in this regard. even when you take the issue of repatriations and the whole documentation of due diligence, human rights documentation, giving workers a chance to register complaints of non-payment of wages and things like that. Both countries of origin and destination did not see this as a due diligence element, principle, and so a lot of the repatriation processes have been hurried, botched up, and migrants have then been left stranded to fend for their own kind of thing. So I think this, from where Stefan started, that this was all prior to the pandemic. I will say in the pandemic, what we've seen is, and what some of the panelists have referred to, it fell apart, the fragility of it. And that's why this is something we might want to look at in terms of implementing the Compact and Global and Objective 12, that how do you put firmer, stronger foundations based on human rights principles? How can that be enduring, even in times of crisis? Be tested and endured during times of crisis. But I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, William. And I think, what an opportune time for us to think about this reset. What an opportune time for us to think about a solid foundation, because, as we go through the global reviews of this global compact that everybody had been awaiting for from the time it was talked about, and then countries signed up, some countries did not, but in moving forward, we're now 2 years down the line, we really need to see how helpful has it really been in steering some of these processes forward. But like you said, its foundation as well as was fragile in that sense, and I think it comes out in digging through each of these objectives and sort of understanding what the reset would be, given the context of COVID as well, which has managed to shake up a lot of the foundations that we have had, or has also shown us in places where we didn't have solid foundation. So thank you for that, bringing that in, and also talking about the role of the civil society in sort of pushing for this due diligence that comes both from sending countries and receiving countries. And I mean, Innocent Duru had just been trying to highlight to us, what sort of happens to migrants when they have returned. So, after all the due processes are done, when they have returned, what's the due diligence, I would say, in that particular case? What was expected? What should migrants, migrants should fall into safe hands. And I thought that maybe I could bring in Manfred Bergman to give us some of his reflections from his perspective. Manfred, I don't know if you're audible. Can Manfred be made co-host so that he can just come in if he can? And Manfred, I wondered if you could also just give us a perspective from your side and where you're seeing this from. Manfred? Is Manfred here with us? Dr. Sada, is Manfred with us?
His audio is not connected.
His audio is not connected. Okay, then we would try and see if we can move on to our panelists, and then I will come back then to our side panel and get some more feedback. And Stefan, are you with us?
Definitely, yes.
Good. So just coming back again and zeroing in. William brought out this point, talking about the role of civil society sort of really stepping in and trying to push even harder, I guess, and the whole of the society that is not part of government. So let's call them non-state actors in this case, that push for this due diligence in terms of ensuring that the gaps are being filled regardless of the inadequacies of what an objective would say. And I just wanted to get a take from you to hear about some of the work that you are doing at ICMC in terms of helping governments look at this and take it to a different way. As a practical example, listening to, I don't know if you managed to hear what Innocent had to say about returnees in a region like Nigeria, where they have come back, years and years of having been away from home, and a lot of times, migrants are looked at as they are the main contributors. They are the household owners, right? Even though they are sitting far away. So to return home in such a way, and to return home to a space where you don't feel that there's any setting for welcome to start with, and you actually feel more like a criminal criminal, even though your remittances was something that was most important. So how do you see, sort of from the work that you do? I mean, we know at ICMC you provide assistance and protection for vulnerable people when they're on the move, and you are also promoting the sustainable solutions for migrants when they have, for migrants and refugees. So do you want to just talk to us a bit about that?
Indeed, I can, but maybe I would like just to come back to some of the reflection that the other panelists made, and also William's comment about the fragility of where we are at the moment, in particular with the COVID-19 situation. And I think it's important when we look at civil society's engagement, we probably need to divide Objective 12 into three, because we have three separate kind of sub-objectives or objectives in Objective 12. The first one, and I think at least two of the panelists focus on that first part, is the whole issue of having access to transparent, simple migration procedures. And that basically affects the daily life of migrants applying, for example, for work visas, dealing with non-transparent agents being exploited when they arrive in the country of destination, etc., etc. So you see all the obstacles, and I think there you have a specific role for NGOs and civil society in general to accompany, but also to empower migrants, and in particular to provide adequate information to help them identify simplification in the procedures, not to fall into the hands of unscrupulous agents, for example. But this is an area where ICMC is not involved. So the second one is we are talking about purely migration procedures, but with the objective of identifying very vulnerable people, victims of trafficking, children in general, women at risk, people with disabilities, etc., etc. Again, this is not something we are involved in. We would like to, but I mean, by definition, an NGO has to choose its battles. So our battle is more the third one, which is mixed migration. Because traditionally and operationally, while ICMC has been doing a lot of advocacy on migration and on migrants' rights, but we are operationally more involved on the refugee side. We have a long tradition of being involved in resettlement procedures. And what we did is that in situation of mixed migration, we have expanded our, let's say, expertise, for example, in terms of child protection, expanded towards refugees who would not be considered as migrants, but would still be in need of protection as refugee kids, for example, to determine what is their best interest. So we have been involved in a lot of best interest assessment, both for refugee and for migrant children. So this is really the area where we have been involved. We believe that you have, if we have time to go through it, but it may not be necessary, is that for every single procedures, for example, to identify people with vulnerability, whether it is in the context of mixed migration or only in the context of relatively simple, sorry to use the expression, migration, then you have 6 phases in the process. And at one point, it might be good to go through them to see how, for example, civil society can contribute.
Thank you for that, Stefan. And I hope I was hoping we could also get back to Alethea on some of the questions that we've asked. I think Stefan has sort of also, in coining all that, has raised the the issue that we have in terms of vulnerability that goes, for instance, with victims of trafficking being part of this pool. We know in parts, the region that I am from in Southern Africa, there is a lot of mixed migration. I mean, the flow of migrants that are heading, for instance, to South Africa, as an example, would be mixed in nature. And in there, you would have also children that are somehow with an adult, whether they have, they have knowledge of who this adult is or not. But when sort of intercepted by the police as a crowd, as a movement of 50, 18, 100 people that have been intercepted at any of the border towns, when they are sort of coming in together, it becomes sometimes difficult for officials to understand how to address the different vulnerabilities, because they are all being looked at as they knew what they were getting themselves into, even though among their midst. I mean, and we know this, having worked in migration, that the point is not the fact that I've consented to it. The point is that there is some exploitation that is going to come with it. So victims of trafficking, and particularly women, children, and also young boys that are being, lumped in this group and not being sort of separately and also more specifically their needs being looked at. So Alethea, do you just want to talk to us from a gender perspective, in this particular area? Could you just talk to us a little bit about it in the gender lens, in connection to what Stefan has sort of said in us trying to understand how we steer this objective forward as well, in terms of us seeing some tangible improvements in the context of the reviews that are going on right now?
Yes, thank you, Patty. Yeah, when we study the different strategies that women are employing to migrate, and the different capitals, I must say, the different resources that they have to migrate, there are huge differences. There is a gender gap between, we would say, like the social capital or the access to information, even the access to have a smartphone. We know that nowadays migrating with a smartphone is not, it's a basic necessity. It's not something that is just like, because they want to have their iPhones. With the smartphones, is a way to get in touch with migrants who have migrated before, to understand where are, for example, shelters are available, if there is a specific police detention, a riot, where are the safest routes to migrate. So the smartphone is a basic instrument to migrate. And we see, starting from that point, we see huge difference between the real access to technology for women, the real access to clear and information on safe routes, for example. What we see is that women tend to migrate through more clandestine routes because they want to avoid contact with military or contact with the agents, who at the end are also the ones who might violate their human rights. They are exposed to, we know, sexual violence, they are exposed to bribery, and sometimes the same agents or the same military. We have not talked about that much, that this militarization of migration controls. There is this, we can talk about a symbolic militarization with all this discourse that stigmatizes migrants, but also a real militarization of borders. And the ones who are more vulnerable to the militarization of borders, of course, are women and migrants. So what we see, I would say, Patty, like the first problem when we study through the gender lenses, the migration routes and the flows, is that sometimes women are underrepresented. Why? Because they are not in the most available points to update information. They are not in the access points where questionnaires or where data surveys are taking place, okay? So the first problem would be subrepresentation. Sometimes women don't migrate through the most typical routes, so they use, for example, other like more clandestine, they are not in the shelters. Sometimes they stay in hotels because they feel safer, but in the other way, they are more vulnerable to other types of violence. Maybe they are not going to face a military, but they are going to are more vulnerable for the traffickers, for example. So I would say that is a problem when they are in transit. But another very important problem that we see, and before talking about trafficking in persons, is that policies are not being driven through the gender lens or through gender perspectives. What happens when women are detained? Women are understood like they are natural caregivers. And when they are migrating, they migrate with their children. And there are very few policies that understand that women should be supported in this task while they are migrating or while they are detained. So we see huge difference between in detention centers in the spaces that are for women and the spaces that are for men. Women still in detention are the natural caregivers of children. And the problem with that is that women, sometimes they lose, or they have less control over their documentation, over their procedures, because they are taking care of their children. So when we see that is a whole family migrating, the ones who have access to all that migration procedure elements, that documentation, etc., are men, not women. Why? Because, as I said, women are in charge of attending the basic needs of their children, and they are worried about medical care. They are worrying about having access to lunch, to dinner, to proper facilities for their children. So this is a very, very important element, that the idea of social division of labor, the idea of sexual division of labor, and the role of women as caregivers are not part of the idea of how can we provide services to women who are migrating. The third thing I would say is that many women who are migrating, if they are forced migrants or they are not, it's very common that they are coming from gender-based violence stories. They come from gender-based violence problems in their families with their partners. And I believe that there is not still a comprehension of all the different violent events that migrant women has gone before arriving to a destination country. I always say, like, women are part of a continuum of violence that starts within their families, with their partners, and then they go through the institutional violence. And that's like the main point. Violence in the community of origin, violence during transit, and then when they arrive in destination countries, women are part of a huge system of institutional violence that is not addressing the needs they have. And just to end my point, is that a clear example of these are the alternatives detention programs. That's something that we still need to work on. We see that women and their children are also detained, and even we have laws that says children cannot be in detention centers. They are, as well as women. Why? And it's because governments say we don't have the capacity to have them in proper shelters, or it's something temporal. It's just for a few hours that they are detained. But sometimes this, as I say, I was talking about discretionary use of policies. At the end, we have seen these images of children and women in detention centers without the proper conditions. So I must say, women are victims of violence from the point of origin through the transit and the destination countries. What you were saying about unaccompanied children is a big drama. We especially also in Europe, but it's a drama in the US with the Central American children and Mexican children who are separated from their parents. So we know that's something we still need to work in. We have been talking about unaccompanied children since 2006 at least. So, and after 15 years, we are still having this problem of that protocols are not enough to identify when a child is migrating alone. The protocols are not enough to understand the needs of a child that might look that he is or she is 18 or 19 years old, but she's really 14. We don't have real protocols to acknowledge the age of the person. And sometimes there are huge human rights violations when addressing and trying to understand how old that person is and their specific needs. And of course, the problem of family separation when children are taken away from their parents while parents are in detention centers. And just finally, because I know we're running out of time, but what you were talking about the victims of human trafficking, I'm not saying something that we don't know, but yeah, when we talk about mixed flows, sometimes women are not victims of human trafficking when they leave their homes. They are migrants who want to have a better life, or they are fleeing, as I said, from violence. They are forced migrants, but they become victims of trafficking during the trajectory, because there is a lot of, as I said, and I will insist on, institutional violence, and there is a lack of responsibility of the countries that are transit countries as well as destination countries, that at the end result in more vulnerable situations and conditions that force women to end up as victims of trafficking. Because if women are not using the traditional channels that could be, we could say, safer, but they are not safe because they have to face a military, and sometimes they get sexually abused even by the police and by the military. So they have to use more clandestine routes. The ones who are taking advantage of those risks faced by women are the traffickers. So at the end, let's think about the possibilities of becoming a victim of trafficking because you didn't find the proper and safe channels to transit through countries or to arrive to a destination country well informed, with officials that explain you that even though you are an undocumented migrant, you have rights in that country. At least you have the right to information, you have the right to accountability in your procedure, you have the right to understand what is a return migration. Because what we see every day with detained women is that they don't, and migrants, not just women, men as well, the first problem is misinformation. They don't understand what are their rights, who is an NGO official, who is an official from UNHCR, who is an official from the government, what does it mean to be returned to your country, what does it mean to be detained, what does it mean to ask for asylum procedure. So I would not say that vulnerabilities come particularly from the institutional perspective. And here I close my statement. Thank you very much.
Alessia, thank you for that. And I think I was speaking to one researcher that works predominantly on migration within the African continent. And this is one of the comments that she also had to make, that sometimes when you ask about violations that migrants have experienced along the journey, the answer that they may give you would be the most recent one and may not have been throughout the entire journey, meaning that if I have crossed at least 5 countries, or I've crossed 5 types of administrations along the way, and crossing meaning that, you know, passing in this irregular way, maybe the last violation, the one that you report to a researcher, is the very last one, and not maybe the very first one that you started off the journey. So I think it's also very important to understand that there's a context to it, you know, that as a migrant who's sitting in front of you, like you have said, sometimes they're not fully aware of what's really going on and where their information also goes. So that's another thing. Where does my information go? You know, as I'm providing different information for this assessment, that puts me into a better space. Who am I speaking with? And as in, you know, who do I speak into? And does that mean that my vulnerability will be increased or reduced? And the same goes with the documentation. You know, we all feel almost, you know, in the migration space, we say everybody should have an ID. And the question also comes, if you have an ID, even though it's not a high standard breeder document, if, you know, as people in border management speak, does that ID give me access to protection, or does that actually also make me much more vulnerable? So these, I think, are kind of the specificities that would need to factor in, you know, as we are implementing the different systems that we have. But I thought to bring in, you know, a good friend of the network and who has worked a lot with civil society organizations, particularly looking at domestic workers. And Rula, I wondered if you could come in here and, you know, talk to us a little bit about these sort of national referral mechanisms and how far they really go into you know, addressing the needs of the vulnerable migrant workers, and maybe particularly here, if you could just center it around domestic workers. Rula?
Yes, thanks, Paddy. I mean, it's an interesting question about national referral mechanisms and all of that. And I think what I take from this webinar is really that, there's not enough in terms of, making migration certain and predictable. We all know that there's a lot of problems, and we've heard a lot about these problems. So migration is not certain and predictable in any way, and whatever we see, on the ground is not really related to the needs that we face every day. And I think it's there is a little bit of contradiction here, because I think as long as there is a little bit of unbalance, because as long as in a way we only talk about the right to leave your own country, but this is not paralleled also by a right to enter another country, there will always be this issue of how do you make something certain and predictable? How do you make it a right if at any given moment that right can be shifted and can be changed? Is it more of a right, or is it more than a privilege? And I think we are more unfortunately, in the latter category. What we've seen in COVID is that, migration can shut down. People can be, forced in their own places with nowhere to go, stranded as well in countries of destination, stranded waiting to be, deployed for work. And so how is this kind of certain and predictable? I think this is, the ambition of the objective is so much more than what we actually see in the text. And I think Stefan really alluded to this issue. And I think there's a long way to go into making migration certain and predictable, starting with having this balance between, rights to leave, but also the right to enter. And how do we really embody this in the policies that we have? And with regards to domestic workers, and I think this is kind of bigger than just domestic workers, obviously this is a very specific issue, but I would look at this also more from the lens of skills. And I think maybe, we haven't kind of looked a lot at skills, because I think the higher skilled you are, the more opportunities, the easier it is. And also the more you know what the procedure is, and the lower skills, obviously domestic work is one of them. The less certainty there is in your own journey, the less certainty there is in how the migration will work out for you as well. So, let's look at this from a skills perspective as well. That's all from my side. Thanks, Fadi.
Thank you, Rula, for that. So I think I would move on to, I wanted to ask if we still have Florida and Henry with us. Henry, if you are there, and while you're unmuting your mic, thinking about the work that you're doing, the lawyers, Lawyers Beyond Borders Philippines, and what we've sort of just alluded. I think we had a question for you in there, that we wanted to just bring in. Henry, are you still with us?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Adi,
Just,
yes.
if we sort of move from this very nice commitment, as Stefan had put it in the very beginning, that maybe we wanted to have a nice commitment in there that could sort of push the countries going forward. And I wanted you to comment a bit from the point of access to the sending countries, right? And I think you already alluded to this, and also talk a little bit into sort of this criminalization of being undocumented from the perspective of the work that you're doing at Beyond Borders.
Thank you, Paddy. Well, in our network, the Lawyers Beyond Borders, as I've mentioned, we in the Philippines is part of a bigger network, Lawyers Beyond Borders. There are other lawyers groups in other countries that assist migrant workers. No? We're trying to develop a pro bono culture among lawyers to take up the advocacy for migrants' rights and welfare, and to handle actual cases of migrant workers, be they in the countries of origin and countries of destination. Now, our focus is on access to justice of migrant workers, which we hope the global compact for migration in both countries of destination and the countries of origin. And as mentioned earlier by William and the other speakers, the COVID pandemic really became a crucial test of sorts, so for this developing global compact on how to govern migration internationally when all things came down. And you can see this in this problem of wage theft. So many migrant workers were not paid or sent home. Hard-earned money were not given to migrant workers, and when they go home to their countries of origin, they have no access on how to get what was not given or what was stolen from them. So the global compact I see is not binding to the participating countries, perhaps because they don't want to take responsibilities for it, but there are certain obligations that have to be undertaken, no? And must be understood by all countries to be not only for the benefit of all countries of migrants, but also to the best interest of all countries, both migrant of countries of destination and countries of origin. So we, in the work that we do for the Lawyers Beyond Borders, we are practicing lawyers. Most of us are private lawyers, but we devote time to handle migrant workers cases, both in countries of origin and countries of destination. It is one important role that we think that we should do, and not only for lawyers, but for many groups that we're doing now, is to strengthen cross-border collaboration. When we deal with crossing borders, we deal with different territories, different laws, and different procedures. And this calls for different expertise and specializations. And we deal with different jurisdictions. So in one place, a lawyer may be able to do a lot of things within the jurisdiction of the law where he may practice, but he's practically useless when he crosses borders and in defense of the rights of migrant workers. So we see this as cross-border collaboration in many cases of migrant workers to be very important. We learn a lot from our fellow lawyers, and we also, not only on the immigration rules, but also on how to address migrant workers' problems through the courts, through regular procedures, or even out of the box, non-traditional methods of addressing these migrant workers' problems. Yeah, Paddy, thank you.
Henry, thank you for that. I wonder if we could bring in Florida. Just as we will go at, I've just asked in the chat box if somebody would like to ask a question after Florida has given her her feedback. I think we'll take one last round of questions. Florida, just coming back to you again, and I think you had raised some very important points there from the perspective of Malaysia, you know, not just talking about the role of these migrant resource centers, for instance. I think that was, and then also talking about how narrow the perspective can be from the government point of view in terms of really sticking to legality when you have to look at provisions that have to go for migrants. And I also liked, you know, how you brought in this sort of walking through and with migrants. So, you know, combining those kind of spaces, did you want to talk about, you know, how those gaps could be, you know, that perspective that governments would have in terms of provision and in terms of moving this objective forward, you know, that you are able then to, you know, that the assessment, that there's, I mean, like Rula said, that it is difficult to make some kind of, you know, predictability, but in one way or another to improve that in terms of and up to all the way until referral.
Right. I think as far as Malaysia, you know, the selling point is that we are shortage of labor. I think we must acknowledge that we do need migrant workers to fill in the gap where, you know, we don't have sufficient labor workforce. I think in terms of economically, if I were to look into it, when you have migrant workers turnover in an industries, for instance, it is not good to the company. It's not good to the economy. It backfires us in a way. So I strongly feel that, you know, when I'm walking through cases and I see issues faced by migrant workers, it kind of tells me that, you know, they're actually good worker. They really put in their effort. In fact, employers also like them because there's a lot of dedication is coming from them. in the workforce. And this is something, it's a wasted energy if you just have to see them go at the end of their contract, or even be it refugees, asylum seekers, they all do have a very specific talent that is actually in return is going to help us back in our economy. And the government do recognizes that, yes, we do have refugees in the country, and there was some steps taken by the government, in trying to bring in the refugee population into the workforce and giving them the proper recognition and all that. But the thing failed in a way because it was too rigid and it was too much of control, which is not something that what refugees are actually looking for, because they are not migrants here coming into the country for a specific job that was actually promised to them before they left. So the dynamic is different, and this is something that the Malaysian government kind of have to acknowledge it and have to accept it. And they do come with skills, they do come with talent, and it's a wasted effort if we don't recognize their skills and we don't recognize their talent. So my selling point to the government is that they need to be open to hear this. They should be open to dialogue, open to, recognizing that we don't want to lose good talents if we find one. So, if that could be the selling point, that at the end of the day, this is in return is actually going to help our country's economy. Instead of us bringing in more migrant workers into the country, we already have a huge population of, not huge, I mean, a small number of population of refugees already here, given the recognition. Give them that venue for them to work until they get resettled, to a third country. And that, I believe, it's not too much to ask as a selling point.
I think that would be a selling point that even has evidence, isn't it, Florida? If you look at the German case, I think Germany was, one of those that tried to highlight that, to say that if you just provided the space for migrants to contribute to the national economy and to actually work, you could see not just the benefits for themselves, but also the benefits that they make in terms of the human resource provision to the state itself. And I think this has been sort of a selling point that even, speakers in migration and development are making, to say, refugees, particularly, and asylum seekers, when they come in, they have been, productive where they have come from. And any migrant in that case has been productive, and they come with a skill. And I think it's also in this week that we are seeing, I think there's a story that I haven't followed into the intricate details, but it seems to be, the new vaccine that's being created out of Germany, and how migration has been coined in by looking at the migrants. And I think that it's a couple, isn't it, in Germany that have coined this. I'm not sure if it's completely a vaccine or, the one that's supposed to be 99%, or is it 90% much more efficient. So we can see what the benefits can be like, when migrants are allowed to thrive. And I think this is the thing as well. When you talk about restrictions, isn't it? If you want me to enter into a productive sector, then you give me the ability to thrive rather than the ability, you give me the flexibility to thrive rather than coining people in. So yeah, nice reflection there, Florida.
But just another thing I would like to add is also the concerns about children, especially the refugee children and the stateless children. And I believe one of the speakers earlier also mentioned about the situation in Sabah, where you have a lot of children who are stateless. And that goes, from generation to generation. And the point that I would like to stress here is that most of these children are actually left out from the basic education. And that is a very fundamental thing. I remember sitting in one forum and in Sabah, and one of the ex-commissioner of Suakam said that it's actually a very sinful act to do when you deprive children of their basic education. If children doesn't know how to spell their name and write their name, it's a very sinful act. We don't know what the potential of these children has, and we don't give them that opportunity. It's a very sad thing to do. And to some extent, I think, there has been some work in Sabah where they allowed children I think the Indonesian government came in and stepped in, and they've opened this private school, even despite being undocumented children can go in there. But I still believe there is still a large number of children, both in Peninsula as well as in Sabah, who are left out from the education or the opportunity for a higher education or opportunity for vocational skills, for example, teenagers and things like that. So I feel this is something that we also have to look into. It's not something that we should not. I mean, I'm not looking into labor part of it as well, but the life of the children, young children, we can't. It's of no fault of theirs, that they are in this situation. It's their family from generations to generation has become undocumented. There are documentation why sometimes parents failed, or there are obstacles for them to register the child. It could be a lot of things that has brought to this end, but the children at the end of the day are suffering of no fault of theirs. And this is something that should be very strongly advocate and looked into as well.
A very valid point, and I think you also see it in terms of mixed migration flows and what that means, regardless of how long it has been that children have been in transit. From some of the research that I have been involved in myself, where you sort of asked also from departments of social welfare or education officers at a very local level to say, so the vulnerable, when children who form the vulnerable groups of migrants that you'd have been hosting in your communities, what kind of provisions are given to education? And the answer would sort of be, well, they're not here long enough. And I think, Florida, you've made a valid point in saying, even if they were long enough to know how to write their name, I think that education still remains very valid for them, and bringing them into the space. Of course, they are in particular cases of mixed migration flows, there could be some hindrances that are related to language aspects and so on. But I think that just the effort has not been made in some instances, just because they feel that they are there for such a temporal period. But we have seen in places where children are, in a case where the assessment is being made of what will happen to them, once they've been intercepted or once they have been brought into the safe spaces, that they could also be fused into other community, community alternative education systems, and not so much maybe the national system. Like there's some flexibility, like you have said, in just ensuring that they can, write their name, or they can pick up. And even though there are some integration issues that could be a problem for these children, but I think allowing that space in the very beginning, it still remains something that is critical, and because these children are, we depend on them for their future, whether it's the future of the country they are in or the next country that they will go to. So I think that was a very nice way to sort of end Florida. And I just thought, we are almost nearing the end. We have asked, I think I've picked up all the relevant questions that have come through. And just to ask each of the panelists, maybe starting up with Stefan and following on as we came through, your sort of 1 point that you would like to sort of leave out on this platform and this forum, sort of really looking at how critically we are moving with this, starting with Stefan, and then we'll go to Alethea.
Okay, I will go, thank you. I will go back to the need to identify vulnerable migrants, whether it's in a context of mixed migration or among mainly migrant population. I think we need to keep in mind that if we want to do proper screening, profiling, identification, counseling, and then referral, any practitioner will tell you that you need a minimum of half an hour for each case, which means that if you are in an emergency situation where you have thousands of people entering the country every day, and then potentially between 10 and 15% of those numbers to be potentially vulnerable, just imagine the number of staff you need to do the job. And you need to have trained staff. You cannot do child protection referral if you have no clue. You cannot do gender responsive assessment if you have not been trained. You need to have a female staff and not to have, untrained, for example, police officer doing the job, etc., etc. So I just want to say that here I'm not talking about governments where there is a willingness not to meet international standards, but governments really trying to do their best. And even for those governments, it's extremely complex and complicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Alethea?
Yes, I would just briefly emphasize the importance of addressing transparency and accountability in transit countries. I believe we have to provide more assistance and to really have a global governance with the idea of sharing perspectives and strategies, integrating transit countries. I would also insist on alternatives to detention programs as a core strategy for gender and child sensitive referral mechanisms. We should eliminate, completely avoid detention for women and children in any case. I know I'm starting to talk about the objective for next week, but well, it's part of my work is on detention. The third one, I would say we need to enhance strategies and measures against all practices of discrimination, because we know xenophobia is growing so much in all countries at all levels, with this global discourse of criminalizing immigrants as I said, not only dangerous people, but also people who are sick. And the reality is that people get sick while they are in detention centers, not before. They don't arrive with an illness. They get ill because of the conditions when they are detained. That's the reality. And the fourth one, I think it's very important to guarantee not only training and access to information on basic social rights, but to guarantee that, especially in the provision of health and educational services, but to provide this information and this training to all actors involved. Because what we see is that sometimes the national level, agents at national level, public servants are well trained and informed, but when it comes to the local level, then it's a big problem. So we need to emphasize the interministerial coordination as a key element to reinforce, particularly at local level, this part of the Objective 12 that is about training and giving information. The information is not just for the migrants, the information is also for the public servants, because sometimes they don't know, especially at local level, that migrants have rights to have health services and educational services, and there is a lot of miscoordination among ministries. And for the moment, I think that would be it. I am really grateful for the opportunity of sharing some ideas today. Thank you very much, Patty, and all the organization here.
Alethea, thank you for sharing your very important knowledge. And I think all the 3 points you made. In your last point, you've just reminded me of sort of this need also, like you have said, of a multi-sectorial approach in terms of training that's provided. And that really looks at, who can the migrant come in contact with? Because indeed, your first point of contact may be a policeman. Your first point of contact may be a head of a community leader. Your first point of contact could be that's, a business owner in a small shop as migrants are coming in and crossing borders. Your first point of contact could be health workers, could be an education officer, could be anybody. And I think that's very important in terms of determining the needs of these migrants, that it's actually multi-sectorial in the training that's provided for government officials that are involved in these kind of assessments and in ensuring that migrants' rights are also enshrined and provided for. I wondered if I could bring in Henry, and then Florida.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Patty. I would just like to emphasize 3 points. First is on the need to bring the correct, useful, and practical information that may be needed by the migrant workers in order to protect their rights in all stages of migration, and in the process in making the informed and correct choice for their own benefit. So it is important on how we can find ways on how we can give this information to them. Second is the need to protect the most vulnerable sections of the migrant workers, especially the undocumented, the children of the undocumented workers and the victims of human trafficking. And third is on the need to have in place access to justice of migrant workers, both in the countries of origin and in the countries of destination, with close cross-border collaboration between state and non-state actors who are addressing the issues and problems facing migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Florida?
Okay, to sum up, I would say that the most important thing is that there must be transparency as well as social dialogue. That is the only way forward that involves all stakeholders, everyone. And the sending countries also has a role to play over there as well. But what is more important is that to achieve this, there must be a great political will to do so. Thank you.
That was short and precise, and I think the political will is something that remains enshrined throughout the compact itself. So that's a very nice way to sort of end it, Florida. And I think on that we can say we have come to the end of our webinar on GCM Objective number 12, and we are looking forward to diving into more and more issues. Like Alethea had said, it was almost as though when you speak in this objective, you open up the next one, or you're probably referring, because indeed there are a lot of parallel direct and indirect connections between the various objectives. Thinking about where we started with objective 1, where we looked at data, we've touched on identification, we've touched on legal pathways, we've also touched on trafficking and smuggling, among others, and we can see what the connections are like from one to another. And what our hope is in this forum, in these webinars, through these different organizations that are co-hosting this, is that we can take these conversations really to the next level. So we look forward, and thank you to the over 200 participants that have actively and consistently joined us over the last couple of weeks, actually months, since we started in September. And we continue to ride along our 23 objectives of the Global Compact for Migration. And we thank you, all our panelists for today. Henry, thank you for joining us. Florida, thank you for joining us. Alethea, thank you for joining us. And Stefan, again, thank you for joining us. And you are now free to unmute your mics. I think we have maybe 1 more minute to say goodbye to everyone, and we will be done for the day. Thank you very much. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. That was a nice one. Very
Thank
beautiful.
you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Cosmos.
Thank you. Take care of yourself.